Yeah. Okay. Welcome to this webinar on evolution and free will. Great topic, and we're very pleased and honoured to have Kevin Mitchell from Trinity College Dublin. He's going to show his cover of his book, but just to show I've got a copy. It's here. Fascinating read. Learned a lot from it. Welcome, Kevin. We're very much looking forward to your talk. Please go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeff, and Brian. Thanks for the invitation. It's a
good to go.
Great stuff. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about free will, but really from an evolutionary point of view. This is, of course, an age-old question, whether we're really in control of our actions and whether we really make decisions. And the we bit is the crucial bit there, because clearly, looking at an individual from the outside, they're acting, they seem to be doing things, but the question is whether we as selves, as conscious rational entities, are the ones who are really in control of those decisions. And of course, in ancient times, many people would have thought that our decisions were ruled by the fates or the gods. In Christian theology, that was also prevalent and kind of contentious. Augustine proposed free will as a solution to the problem of evil, where the problem was that an all-seeing, all-powerful, all-good God somehow was allowing evil to happen and could be blamed for it. But the solution was, of course, that if he gave us free will, then we could be blamed for it. And that kind of led to the idea that we had our own free will, but then subsequent theology in Christianity undermined that idea again. So we're left with these sort of various pre-scientific views where our free will is really impinged on by various other factors. And that kind of got replaced in many senses by a scientific view. So from Newton onward, the idea that science reveals a lawful world where the laws are just things that are just happening, to atoms and planets and anything else that we can look at, just determined by the laws of physics, nothing to do with us. It suggests that maybe we are similarly, as physical beings, just determined by the laws of physics. So we're left with a kind of a challenge to come up with some way that we can have free will without magic, without appealing to any sort of immaterial soul or supernatural sort of powers. But also at the same time, we don't want to reduce ourselves to robots. So there's a danger, I think, that if we can explain behavior and cognition in terms of physical mechanisms, which is really the mission statement of neuroscience, that suggests that we're just physical mechanisms, that we somehow disappear in that view. And there's a number of modern challenges to free will, which I'll sort of break down into different headings because they get conflated with each other and they're really importantly distinct. The first of them is what I'll call biological fatalism, just the idea that our behavior is determined by our biological constitution at any moment, which is unchosen, right? We didn't choose to have our brain wired a certain way from our genetics, from evolution, from all our past experiences or so on. So how can we be really in charge of what we do at any moment? So biological fatalism can, in a sense, be made even worse by just having this attitude of neural reductionism. The idea that the real causes are just in our brains or our neurons, and that actually our psychology is just kind of an epiphenomenon. It doesn't have really causal power. What we're thinking about, how could that have causal power in the physical system to push things around inside our neurons? And this is a popular kind of a view amongst many neuroscientists. Sometimes it's very explicit, as here in the case of Francis Crick, who basically just articulates the idea that everything about you that you care about, your joys and sorrows, your memories and so on, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And of course, I would agree, and all neuroscientists would agree, that those things depend on the activity of your nerve cells, but it doesn't mean that they're no more than that. And that's a tricky kind of concept that I want to try and get across. So the implication, though, is that it's all just neural circuits firing and information processing and computation. You can express everything that's going on in our minds in physical terms. And a lot of the successes of neuroscience in seeing which bits of your brain are active when you're thinking about things, or even controlling the behavior of animals, for example, in very precise ways, all of that suggests that really the full causal explanation is down at that level of neurons. Now, the implication then is that these things that we talk about in psychology or cognitive science, like goals and beliefs and intentions and processes of decision making and any mental states, are actually just reducible to neural activity patterns and circuit computations and so on. That's the real level where the real causation is going on. Now, the danger, if you start doing that kind of reduction and going down in levels, is that you don't really have a principled place to stop. And in fact, you could just as well say that all those neural activity patterns and so on are just atoms and molecules obeying the laws of physics. So why aren't we just looking for the full explanations and all the causes at those lowest levels of physics? And there's an implication there that if that's true, that then everything that happens is just already predetermined because of this idea that the lowest level physical interactions are completely deterministic. That there's just one future when you have the whatever at the quantum level or classical levels, and it doesn't matter what you're thinking about. How could that possibly change the way the atoms are going to behave? Now, if that's true, if either the physical predeterminism or the causal reductionism, the idea that all the causes are at the bottom level, if those things are true, then it's not just a problem for free will in humans, it's a problem for any organism. How could any organism be said to do anything, to act, to choose, to decide things? How could it, as an entity, be a locus of causal power, as opposed to just a place where complicated things happen? And that is a fundamental challenge to the idea of agency. And it was one that exercised Charles Darwin himself. He was here musing about the idea of free will in humans, but then looking at other animals as well. And so he said, with respect to free will, seeing a puppy playing cannot doubt that they have free will. This is writing in his diaries, by the way. That's why it's a slightly abridged kind of grammar there. If so, all animals, then an oyster has, and a polyp. So really, really simple kinds of creatures, and we'll talk about some of them shortly. Now, what he says is, though, that the free will of an oyster one can fancy to be the direct effect of organization by the capacities its senses give it of pain or pleasure. And I think he was spot on. And I'm going to try and develop a view of evolution where you start with a simple kind of organization like that allows the organism to control its activity, and then you build on that to get to the capacities that we have. So if we can think of free will as doing things for your own reasons, having the causal power to control your own actions for your own reasons, well, then we can ask, how did doing things for reasons evolve? What does that even mean? How did doing things evolve at all? How did action evolve, and what are reasons? And to get into this, we really have to go back to actually what does it mean to be a living organism? Because this property of agency, though it's not talked about much in biology, is for me absolutely the fundamental distinction, I think, between living and non-living things. So if we think about what a living thing is, this is Erwin Schrödinger and his little book called What is Life, which was based on some lectures that he gave in Trinity College in Dublin in 1943, really a physicist's view of what living organisms are. And his insight was that they are basically improbable patterns of matter. I would say processes now rather than just matter, but that they're resistant to the second law of thermodynamics. So there's some kind of organization. It's thermodynamically improbable, but it sustains itself. It has to do some work to keep itself organized that way, and it can even replicate itself. And when it does that, it can reorganize to recapitulate that kind of organization that we recognize as the thing, whatever the species happens to be. So the second law of thermodynamics, of course, is that things should fall apart and complicated states of matter are improbable. Now, this is just a little schematic of like a single-celled bacterium, for example. And what you can see here is that what characterizes it as the thing itself is this pattern of activity within it, which is biochemical activity. So these might be chemical reactions in all of these sorts of loops and feedback loops, which are all reinforcing each other. So there's a regime of constraints that keeps the whole system going. And it's contained within a cell membrane. So there's an inside and an outside, and it's basically trying to keep itself alive and persist through time by resisting this second law of thermodynamics. So these living things then have these properties that distinguish them from non-living things. Now, the challenge for any living organism is it has to take in energy, of course. It may have to take in food to get that energy, but the challenge is that the world is changing. So in order to keep on surviving in a changeable world, the organism needs to be able to interact with the world in a productive and an adaptive kind of a way. So really to do that, it has to answer two questions. One is what's out there, what's out in the world, and two, what should I do about it? And even very simple single-celled organisms have the capacity to answer at least the second question. And I'll tell you how we get to answering the first question. So here's our little bacterium. It has some sensors on the surface. These are little protein molecules that can, for example, detect chemicals outside the cell. And I've given it a little motor here. This is called a flagellum. It's like a little outboard motor that lets the bacterium move around. So an adaptive thing to do if it needs to get food would be to be able to move towards a food source, to detect a food source and orient its motion in that direction. So to approach it. And also an adaptive thing would be to similarly detect threats in the environment and be able to avoid those. So here we have the very most basic kind of decision making that an organism has to do, which is which way should I go? And in order to do that adaptively, it has to get some information about things in the world. So what happens here is that this little receptor is a protein molecule, and it can bind, say, a sugar molecule outside the cell. And importantly, nothing physical. There's no physical forces that are pushing the bacterium around. It's not being pushed by force. There's no exchange of matter or energy. There's an exchange of information in the sense that when this protein binds something on the outside, it just gives a little wiggle on the inside. It changes its conformation. And then that is in some way transduced into appropriate action inside the cell. So by appropriate, what that means is that that information now has a value which is relative to this goal of persisting. So now we have things, a kind of causation that just didn't exist in the world before living things came along. They have a purpose, which is just to persist. They want to get information about things in the world, and then that information is valuable to them, and it has some meaning, where the meaning here is just configured into the response. So they're not separately apprehending the presence of something out in the world, they're just immediately acting on it. But those signals mean something for the organism. They're physically correlated with something in the environment. They have value relative to this aim, and they're used to mount an adaptive response. But really, it's a pragmatic kind of meaning. And engineers would call this a control policy. So basically, the bacterium's biochemistry is configured in such a way that when it gets a certain signal, like A, whatever that might be, it does a certain action X. So that's like a simple kind of a reflex. And it doesn't seem very complicated. In fact, it's a bit more like this, where there's some contextual sensitivity to the action. So it might be doing several kind of logical operations before it does X in this case. And I want to just give you a little insight into the details of how that happens, because there's an important way of looking at this. There's two ways of looking at it. One is very mechanistic, the other is very organismic, and I want to argue for the second one. So bacteria can move around. They can swim in a straight line, or they can tumble around in a circle and then set off in some random direction. And if there's nothing out in the environment, they'll move like this, and then they'll tumble around, and then they'll move for a bit and tumble around and so on. They take a random walk through the environment. But the purpose of this is to explore for, say, food sources. If they detect a food source, like a gradient of a source over here, then what that will do is bias the switching between these modes of action so that they go in the swimming forward direction more often, and they go up the gradient of the food source. Now, we know an awful lot about the biochemistry of how that happens. So here's X, like a sugar molecule. Here's the little protein receptor. It binds the molecule, and it sends a signal to other proteins inside it, which eventually chemically alter this one in a way that makes it actually rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. That's the important effector. Now, when you look at it like this, it looks very mechanistic. It's like the bacterium's not doing anything, really. It's just a linear passive stimulus response machine where it's being pushed around by its own parts. So the things that are happening within it are making it do things. And I want to draw this distinction here because many neuroscientists, I think, would take the same approach. They would say that when you do something, it's really little parts of your brain that are pushing you around. And I want to argue against that. And even in this simplest kind of version, I don't think that that's correct. This is a much more appropriate way to look at it. So actually, a bacterium doesn't just sit there like they do in the lab, where everything is controlled and we just give it one thing at a time, right? Nature doesn't present itself like that. Instead, it's got all kinds of stuff going on outside it. There's a whole ecosystem that any bacterium has to try and navigate that's highly dynamic with lots of different cues that it might be detecting all at once, like this. And then what it does in response to those cues should depend on its own metabolic state. Things like cell density, temperature outside, other aspects of the conditions, they all have to be integrated in a really holistic kind of a way. And the bacterium also brings its own history to bear in figuring out what to do. In fact, the way that it does that, the way that it moves up a gradient, is by comparing the signaling right now to what the concentration was maybe 100 milliseconds before that. So it's doing some temporal integration. It's doing integration across multiple signals. Really, the whole bacterium is involved in this kind of decision, and it's also not passive. It's endogenously active. Its metabolism is constantly in flux. It's constantly moving around by itself. It's not just sitting there waiting for something to happen and then executing a pre-configured single simple response. It's accommodating to information, and then it's which it's actually actively seeking out, and then it's integrating that in order to regulate its own behavior through time, actually not just in an instant. And I think if we can see that even in that very, very simple, that may be the simplest behavior that we know about, actually, that even in that there's an exercise of agency as opposed to just mechanism, then I think the idea of that getting more complicated through evolution becomes easier to get a grip on. Now, there's a challenge. I mentioned earlier this idea of physical predeterminism, and what I've just told you is couched in the idea of meaning, that these signals have a meaning for the organism and that it can execute certain behaviors based on that information. Now, there's a problem to that, which is this question: how could the meaning of the signal have any causal power in the system if it's all just physics, right? If it's all just atoms are just moving, exerting forces on each other, then how could there be any option about which way the bacterium would go? Isn't it all predetermined by the physical state of the universe at some point in time and the laws of the universe, which say, the laws of physics, which say the next state should be like this for the next point in time, but also the one after that, and actually forever, right? So that's the idea of physical predeterminism, and it's one that I think is advertised maybe by some physicists. It doesn't actually hold, thankfully, and it's a sort of an absurd idea, because it basically says that from the point of the Big Bang, 13 some billion years ago, to the point of me saying this sentence and you hearing it, all of that was predetermined on this single timeline of inevitability. So we can think about that in this sense. So the state of a system at time t, exhaustively defined, and that's a really important part, plus the laws of physics, completely determines the state of the system at time t plus 1. Now, if that were true, in that universe, there's no choosing, there's no acting, there's no doings at all. Things just happen. Things just unfold in the way that they were always predetermined to unfold, and there's no choices or options or possibilities open for organisms to choose between. Now, thankfully, this doesn't hold, despite what you might have heard from physics. At the quantum level, it's impossible to define the state of a system with infinite precision. We know that from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But this is also true at classical levels, even though it's not talked about as much. And in terms of the evolution of the system, partly because of this, the equations governing the evolution of those systems often don't have unique solutions. The future actually is quite open. It can go one way or another. So physics doesn't say that predeterminism holds. That's an assumption of some parts of classical physics, which is just handy. It's just a convenient mathematical idealization. It's not a result of physics. So physical parameters really are indefinite in the future, and they become defined through interaction in what we call the present through events that have some duration. So the upshot is that the current state of a system plus the laws of physics do not fully determine the next state. And I like to think about that in this kind of a way where there's some fuzziness to the parameters of things in the future. They become defined in what we call the present. In fact, that's what the present is. It's the time of things becoming defined, and then they're fixed in the past. So here, this is a duration. It's a duration during which the possibilities can go one way or another, and it's a duration during which organisms can really decide. Now, if that's true, then we flip the script. A lot of the discussions around free will start with the idea of determinism, and then they're left either saying, well, okay, we obviously couldn't have free will in that sort of universe, or making some kind of an argument for compatibilism where we can defend moral responsibility in some way that I find just a bit incoherent. But we don't have to start there. Physics doesn't say that. So why don't we just start with indeterminism? And then the freedom just comes for free, right? We don't have to ask where the possibilities come from. They're just in the universe. What we do have to ask is a different question. Now, given all that indeterminacy, right, the future's wide open, lots of things could happen. How does an organism control what actually happens? It's the control that we need to worry about. How can what happens be up to the organism? And so many people would look at this argument and say, okay, look, either the universe is determined, in which case we have no free will, or there's indeterminacy, there's some fundamental randomness at the lowest levels. But if that determines what happens, then we're also not in control, right? There's also no free will. And the trick is to see that the indeterminacy actually is not a positive thing that's pushing things around. It's the absence of complete restriction on the degrees of freedom of the system. So that's an idea that we can call causal slack after George Ellis and Helen Stewart and others. The idea is that the indeterminacy doesn't settle the outcome. It creates causal slack in the system. It just means that this idea of causal reductionism, where all the causes of what's happened are at the lowest physical level, that just doesn't hold. What it means is that you can have some causation based on how the system is organized in ways that can constrain the physical evolution of the system. So that idea shouldn't be that controversial, although for some people it seems to be. But the idea is basically that physical forces are just not the only things that count as causes. Constraints also count as causes. So for example, this laptop that I'm using is constraining the electrons that flow within it based on the architecture of its hardware, based on the program that it's running. It's not changing the laws of physics. The electrons still are behaving like electrons. It's just that the initial conditions under which they're acting are constrained, and so the possibility space is therefore not infinite. It's much more limited, and it's limited for a function, right? So those kinds of constraints are not they're not just limiting, they're enabling. Constraining the lower level parts at one level enables higher level functions to emerge. And that's how design works, but it's also how evolution works. It's how organisms work. So the configuration of living systems has been selected to ensure their persistence. We saw that in the little bacterium that's organized a certain way that embody a regime of constraint, right? A collective kind of regime of constraints that keep the whole system going. And it has all kinds of little functional systems within it, like the receptors, like the motor proteins and all the integrating proteins within it that control behavior in a way that's most adaptive for these organisms. Now, when we got multicellular organisms, they face the same challenges that single-celled organisms do. They have to figure out what's out in the world, what they should do about it. But they also have another challenge, which is that they have all these different cellular parts, all these different body parts, and their movements have to be coordinated. And that's probably what nervous systems actually evolved for, was just to initially just coordinate the movement of multicellular animals. And secondarily, it became attached to sensory information and then internalized cognition. So here's a little polyp of the type that Darwin was talking about in that quote earlier. This is called a hydra. It's a little marine polyp about yay big. It doesn't have a brain. It has the simplest kind of nervous system that we know about, just called a nerve net, this distributed set of nerves. There's a few sort of intercalated different functions there. And the hydra has a few actions that it can do. It can kind of squeeze itself this way. It can elongate. It can actually move its head around and stuff like that. But it's quite simple repertoire of actions, and it chooses between them based on information about what's out in the world. Is there food around? Is there light around? And so on. Okay, so it's using its nervous system as a control system. That's what nervous systems are for. This is a slightly more complicated critter. This is the nematode C. elegans. It's a microscopic soil-dwelling nematode. It has exactly 302 neurons in every animal of this type, and some of those neurons are condensed in its head in what we can call a brain. So these guys also have quite simple behaviors. They move forwards, they move backwards, they look for mates. That's about it, really. And they have these sensory neurons, so they're sensitive to odorants, so chemicals out in the world, and they're sensitive to touch. That's basically it. And what's interesting, though, is that, so we have these sensors, these little pink triangles up at the top. These are the sensory neurons. And then these little purple ones down here are the motor neurons that activate particular sequences of muscles in order to move forward or move backward or wiggle its head around. Right? So this is its repertoire of actions. It has to do one of these things at a time, and it has to inhibit all of the other ones. So that's basically what its decision has to be executed as. What's interesting, though, in the middle is this set of red neurons, which are called interneurons. So now the linkage between sensation and action is decoupled a little bit. Now you have this internal layer where signals are being integrated in a way that is quite holistic, right? The whole organism is integrating all these signals, again, based on its recent history and so on, in order to figure out what to do in any moment. Now, these guys are kind of doing some simple cognition. They're using information to solve problems, to direct adaptive behavior in novel scenarios. That's a reasonable description of cognition, I think. But it's quite simple, right? They're not thinking about much because they just don't have much to think about. Their sensorium, the things that they can sense about the world, is very limited, just to chemicals in the world or things that are directly touching it. So it's very local, immediate stimuli, which means that cognitively speaking, they inhabit the here and now. They have no sense of anything any further off in the world in space or time than right now, right here. Now, what happened, of course, over evolution is that we developed long-range senses. So smell and touch are very short range, very immediate, but vision and hearing are long range. And the difference here is really key. When you're smelling or touching something, you're literally contacting the thing that you're interested in, right? That the organism is interested in, an object that's touching you, a chemical that's right there. But when you're doing vision, for example, you're not touching the thing that you're interested in, just photons are hitting your retina. And what you have to do is infer what those things were bouncing off of in the world before they hit your retina. So there's all kinds of internal processing that has to go on to interpret these disturbances in the fields that are caused by the objects of interest in order to infer what those objects can be so as to direct adaptive behavior. So we don't care, right? We don't care about photons hitting our retina. We're not conscious of photons hitting our retina. We don't perceive that. What we perceive is the inference about the objects that are out in the world. And there's a whole sort of levels and levels of visual processing that have to go on in order to make those inferences. And what they lead to is this internal mental world, right? We have these extra layers. So we're now doing cognition internally in ways that open up a kind of really an open-ended potential for thinking about things. This is an example from a self-driving car. So the self-driving car has the same problem. It has to parse the incoming data, which is just streams of photons, into other vehicles, the road, pedestrians, traffic lights, things that it needs to avoid, and so on. And of course, we need to do the same type of thing in order to get around in the world. And that kind of extraction of meaning, right, sense making in that sense of our data starts at the very first set of neurons in the retina, the photoreceptors, and their information from different photoreceptors is integrated by these retinal ganglion cells down here, which can be responsive to either when this guy becomes active or this guy becomes inactive. And as a result, they're basically contrast detectors. So they respond really well when there's a change in illumination over the surface of the visual field that retinal ganglion cell is surveying. And that kind of idea where each level of the hierarchy integrates information from multiple neurons below it and therefore abstracts higher and higher order features of the visual scene continues as the information goes through the visual cortex. So here's the primary visual cortex, the first spot in the cortical region where visual information is conveyed to. And cells in this region are responsive to lines of different orientation. But as you go higher and higher, you get cells that are responsive to kind of simple shapes or features, and ultimately to things like faces. So there's a part of your brain right here that if you can see my face on the screen, will have a representation of the inference that there's a face out in the world. Right? And that's now an internal thing. It's decoupled from action, but you can use it to inform action. That's the crucial part. So we've gone from this kind of a thing that Darwin was talking about in simple polyps, where they're pre-configured in a way to do that he called it pleasure and pain, but you can talk about approach and avoid control policies in response to various signals. You can do a certain degree of integration, but it's all at one level. And it's actually quite limited how many things you can integrate at once at one level, right? What we get with a complicated nervous system is that we can do some extraction of higher order features, like a face, for example, but we don't have to just couple it to immediate action. Instead, we just report it. Right? We just report that to the rest of the system. So now the cognitive economy at large can use that piece of information along with all the other pieces of information and link that to prior knowledge in order to make an all things considered judgment about the best thing to do in a way that couldn't possibly be pre-stated or predetermined, because we face all these novel scenarios that are incredibly mathematically complex, right? There's no way you could pre-state all of that in some algorithmic fashion. You really have to think. You really have to do the cognition in that time period, the time period of the present. It's not an instantaneous transition from one state to the next. Now, the other thing that we get with nervous system, which is really key, is that they can learn. Right? That's what nervous systems are really good for. So the organism doesn't just encounter the world as anew at every moment. Right? It's building this prior knowledge. It's bringing its own history to bear on the problem of what to do. And that kind of action-oriented knowledge basically infuses all of our perception. Our perception is not passive. It's not neutral. It's a set of skills that we bring to recognizing objects in the world by linking them to our known memories of their properties, the kinds of things that make up, say, an apple or a dog, the kinds of things that you can do with an apple or a dog or a glass or a desk or whatever it is. So we build up this understanding of the causal relations in the world, properties of objects, but also based on events that we've experience. So when A happens, B tends to follow it. That's the kind of contingency that we can reliably use to make predictions about the world and to enrich our model of ourselves and the world and the interactions between them in order to best adaptively control what we do and determine our own behavior through time. So that idea of behavioral control, I think, is really the key element of what we can call free will. in a sense that if we're perceiving things in the world, we're interpreting them in the context of our internal states, our drives, and what our goals happen to be at the time. We're thinking of possible actions that we could do, but then we're evaluating those in a simulated kind of a way. We don't just have to act out in the world. We can submit those ideas to a system which basically makes predictions about what the outcome would be, predictions about how useful those outcomes would be, and then there's a kind of a competition between the various things that we could do, and one of them will win. One of them will be resolved. That's the thing that we decided to do. We'll release that action. We'll inhibit all of the other ones, but then it doesn't stop, right? Then we assess, well, what was the outcome of that? Was it good? Was it bad? And then we update our model. So we're constantly learning, constantly updating our own historical record of what we did, and then we'll go back up here to the next moment when we're encountering the world. And I want to make a point here that I think is really important, both in a lot of the neuroscience experiments, for example, or even with our little bacterium, we often do these experiments where we're giving an organism, it's tightly controlled, and we're exposing it to some kind of a stimulus right in the moment, and then we're asking it to do A or B. Now, that's an extraordinarily artificial way of thinking about behavior. We don't go through life passively reacting to a series of isolated stimuli and then making binary choices on at each moment. We manage our behavior through time. We have agendas, right? We have goals that we are pursuing. Because we have a goal that constrains or informs the activities that we choose to do at any given moment in order to further that goal. So that kind of ongoing, nested sort of control of our behavior is a much richer way of thinking about it than this sort of binary, instantaneous choice that a lot of the free will literature concerns itself with. And of course, what we're doing is we're selecting new goals and activities and actions all the time. So we're not just selecting actions, we're making plans, right? We're selecting new goals. I mean, you guys had a goal to listen to me give this talk, and that goal, when you selected it, is now constraining the actions that you're doing right now. And that's a trivial example, but you could imagine a goal like getting a degree from college, which is a 4-year project, and every day that you have that goal, it's going to constrain the particular actions that you do, the activities, and down to the level of specific motor actions. But this is like the least interesting bit. The really interesting control is going on up here, right? The self-directedness is very much at that level. And we're optimizing over multiple goals, again, in ways that don't have pre-statable outcomes. There's no way to pre-state how to weight different plans and goals against each other. You just have to figure it out through the process of cognition. Now, human beings in particular evolved these extra levels of the cortical hierarchy, especially the prefrontal cortex, which just gets really outsized in humans compared to other primates and monkeys and so on. So we have this hugely expanded prefrontal cortex. That area is crucial for what we call executive function, which is things like planning, impulse control, keeping things in mind, working memory, and sustaining behavior, but also, being sensitive to changes in environment so that we can switch a behavior if things happen or if we adopt a new goal. Excuse me. So what I want to say is that what happens is really up to us. It's based on the meaning of those neural states that encode or represent beliefs about what's out in the world. They represent our current emotional states, which is basically signals for things that we should pay attention to help direct our behavior. The desires, the goals that we have, also the possible actions that we can think of, their evaluated outcomes and so on. So all of that is going on with this internal, holistic, integrative cognition. It's as far from a passive stimulus response machine as you could imagine. I'm just going to skip through this little bit, which was just to try to convince you that it really is the meaning of those things that's important. We can go back to that if there's questions about it. I just want to make one final point, which is that we have evolved this extra level of reasoning. So animals can reason. They can try to figure stuff out depending on how complicated the animal is. They can certainly do things for reasons, but we have this extra level where we can reason about our reasons. So our cognition is not just populated by objects like things in the world, what we believe, desires that we have. It's also we can think about those thoughts. Right? So, for example, if we have two beliefs, we can say, well, are those consistent with each other? Or how certain should I be in one of those beliefs or the other one? And that's really useful information in guiding behavior in a more sophisticated kind of a way. So we're aware of our own cognitive processes. We can examine and consider, we can reconsider, we can change our minds, all of which depends on the fact that decision making is just not an instantaneous transition from one state to the next. It's a set of processes that are sort of interlinked and talking to each other that take place over a duration of time. This is an example of somebody doing some reasoning. This is Darwin's decision about whether he should get married or not. In this case, he was marrying his cousin. And there were some positive, so there were some pros to the idea of getting married, constant companion, friend in old age, and so on, having children, and then there was some pros to not getting married, like no quarreling and freedom to go where one likes, and so on. So he weighed up these different pros and cons in a very, extremely rational, sort of detached kind of a way, and then of course he did decide to get married. So this picture, this evolution of increasing complexity and sophistication of control actually harkens back to ideas from Aristotle, who talked about, he sort of split the living world up into things with what he called vegetative souls, where, soul here doesn't have to have a kind of a religious connotation. It just means the collective self, the entity itself, where things just have reproduction and growth, what we would call self-organization and maintenance. And then he distinguished from those animals which have sensitive souls, so they can move, they can sense things in the world. We would say they can do perception and cognition and goal-directed action. And then humans, where we have this metacognition and consciousness, what he called a reflective kind of a soul or a rational soul. And I think those are actually reasonable enough distinctions to make, though there's no reason to draw sharp boundaries, as opposed to probably a continuum of sophistication, I think. But I hope what I've done, or what I've tried to do, is naturalize the idea of free will. So we don't have to think about it as either this kind of magical power that overrides the laws of physics somehow, or as something that couldn't possibly exist in a world where the laws of physics hold. Instead, we can think about it as something that emerges in organisms at a macro scale of organization, which is an evolved biological capacity for rational cognitive control of our behavior. That seems like a reasonable definition of free will. It doesn't mean it's absolute or unlimited. That wouldn't make any sense for it to be uninformed by any prior causes. Of course, it's an organism bringing its own history to bear on the world. That's how it, first of all, how it maintains itself as a self through time, but also how it accumulates any kind of causal power by having paid attention to things in the world. So we don't have absolute freedom. That would be a nonsense. We have degrees of freedom, and within those degrees of freedom, we constrain the possibility space so that what happens is what we want to happen. So really, ultimately, some things really are up to us. There's no violation of physics. There's no magic required. And I will leave it there, and thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll be delighted to have some questions.